Oh, she's doing a postdoc there. Oh, wow. So you didn't take the postdoc option. Where are you working now?
I work as consultant in ISB that takes me. I finished there. I'm Mr. You can Mr.
Hello.
I'm Mr. Yes.
Now I have to repeat myself. Got it. Okay. All right, I've been told to repeat myself. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Ekeminia Basi Eyita Okon. I am the acting research director here at the Wits School of Governance, and I'm standing here on behalf of our head of school, Professor Temba Maseko. And I would like to welcome you all to this dialogue today. As you've known, we've been working on or having our WSG election series, taking stock of the upcoming South Africa's election and what that means, the implications of that for the region, for the country, and for the world. And today, the conversation continues where we explore and try to understand what the implications of the 2024 elections, which is a landmark election, what implications it will have for Africa, and what implications it will have for the world. And so today, to kick off this series, I would like to welcome our panelists as well as our moderator. First of all, let me introduce Professor Omano Edijeji. He is a professor of practice at the University of Johannesburg. Prior to this, he was the former special advisor on research and special program to the governor, Nasir Ahmed El-Rufai in Nigeria. He holds a PhD in political science with specialization in the political economy of development from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. He is the recipient of a certificate in key executive leadership from the School of Public Affairs, American University. Please join me as we welcome Prof. Omano Edijeji. Secondly, I would like to welcome Professor Remi Ejibewa. He is a professor of international relations, currently serving as ambassadorial fellow at the Institute for Policy and Strategic Studies, IPSS, previously served as Director of Political Affairs at the ECOWAS Commission in West Africa, and has organized and observed elections across ECOWAS region for over 1 decade. Please give a round of applause to Professor Ajibewa. And finally, I would like to welcome Ms. Palesa Sekijani. Until recently, she's been acting director of the Africa Institute of South Africa, AISA, located within the Human Science Research Council, HSRC, which we are familiar with. She holds a substantive position of Director of Partnerships at the HSRC and has been active in observing governance trends and transitional politics across Africa. Please welcome Ms. Palesa Sekujani. And finally, I would like to introduce our very own Professor Adebayo Olukoshi. He would be the moderator for today's session. He is a distinguished professor here at the Wits School of Governance. He has over 35 years of experience in academia and practice in international relations, governance, development, and human rights. A round of applause for Professor Olukoshi. At this point, I will hand over to our moderator and looking forward to an engaging session.
Thank you very much indeed, Ekemini. Thank you for the warm welcome to our panelists. Let me also thank our colleagues who are here physically, as well as those who are online, for joining us for this conversation, which is actually what I might call the grand finale of our dialogue series. that has gone on for about 4 weeks now. And I'm really delighted that we are focusing a session to look at what the elections would mean for the African continent, and also how the African continent is perceiving these elections. So it's a two-way conversation that we'll be having. What are the implications of the elections as viewed from an African perspective? What are the stakes? But also how are countries of the continent perceiving the elections and what it would mean at different levels. To foreground this, we had a conversation last Thursday looking specifically at the elections and ECO and SADC, and SADC, of which, of course, South Africa is a key member. And that conversation also yielded some quite interesting perspectives on what to expect and what people in the SADC countries are also thinking. So let me start by inviting your observations and comments on the electoral landscape globally, because it is said, and it has been widely reported, that 2024 is perhaps the most important electoral year in recent human history. So many countries, more than half of humanity, will be going to the polls. As we speak, India is already voting. I think the final round of the Indian elections are taking place. We've had elections already in Senegal. South Africa is coming up. Ghana is coming up. What's your sense of the continental landscape as it looks like? And what is the significance of elections for Africans where we are today? Maybe I can start with you, Palesa.
Thank you, Prof, and good morning, colleagues. I will attend to that technical challenge as soon as I am done. I think, Prof, referring to, if I'm to reflect on the landscape currently in the continent, which is quite an interesting one, I will look at really the elections that have taken place in the West Africa, which is in the Senegalese one, but also reflecting on Senegal really being in the enclave of the countries that are undergoing transitions, political transitions, or they are unstable, or they are really, and for instance, Mali not being able to keep to its promise to undergo the elections, but also reflect on the current momentum in the Central Africa, where Chad has also just gone through its elections and what it would mean for the Central African. But also, I think just really when you look at that belt really moving from west to east, it's quite a burning. It's a burning area in the continent as far as elections are concerned. So my reflections really is that we are seeing that perhaps maybe as a way of introducing the elections in the continent and in the global context. The continent, I think, it's holding about 37% of the total elections this year. So that's quite significant. And with also the structure of the governance in the continent, we have about most of the countries, they are observing or occupying the authoritarian, with some of them moving to the hybrid, and only about one country that is a full democracy, which is Mauritius. So my submission to that effect is that if we are having countries like Senegal that have thankfully managed to escape that quagmire and managed to hold their elections and escaping that regression, but also Chad in this current moment, having been under authoritarian rule for about 30, if not more years, I think it's an interesting observation with Chad that what does it mean, particularly for the Central Africa? Because are we now going to start supporting Chad as a beacon of hope for a stable Central Africa? And what would that mean? Because I think the significance of Chadian elections is that if Chad is able to build strong bilateral relations with Burundi and eventually in the process be able to influence the DRC, I think we will be in a position to start seeing a stable continent.
Okay, thank you very much, Vanessa. You spoke about the link between the elections and the arc of conflict on the African continent, and the example of Chad is salutary in this regard. Let me turn to you, Professor Ajibewa. You've obviously been involved in your career in organizing elections across West Africa, particularly in a post-conflict, post-authoritarian context. If you look at the overall picture on the continent, and Palesa's reference to the current classification of African countries broadly into three, between the authoritarian, the hybrid, and the democratic. Do elections really matter? Do they hold hope for change, for transformation on the continent?
Thank you. As you rightly perceive or said, election really seems to be the panacea in the sense that without election, there cannot be any government in power. But what we tend to see, looking across my 18 years experience at ECOWAS, working with most of the independent electoral commissions, we tend to see that election per se seems to be things of the past for the populace, given the fact that the apathy is there. The voters does not have any interest even in the elections per se. They tend to believe that their vote does not count. However, given the fact that it's the only way, people need to understand that the election itself has been like that. But however, I also want to contest that election per se, we've seen in some of the countries in Africa, whereby the ruling party is not the one that comes into place after election. We've seen the case of Senegal that we just said. We expected that the ruling party will take, but we tend to see that Faye now, which is a product of the opposition guy, came in. Just likewise in the case of Nigeria as well, we realized that the PDP was there for 16 years, and apparently after that the opposition, presently the APC came in, and they've been on, but that has not led to the destruction of the fabric of the democratic process there. So there's also lessons for South Africa there that nevertheless we know that the ANC is struggling right now, but there might be the issue of coalition, there might be issue of just like we did in other member states. But at the same time, another area where we tend to see is that the transitional government, as they say, the unconstitutional change of government, which leads to coup d'etat over there, and then we have the transitional government. They've also been coming to power in areas like Chad, where we tend to be seen as autocratic. Then we've seen in areas like Togo now, there's another area dimension there. So we've got to believe that election itself is not taken seriously by the people. Just like here in South Africa, we tend to see that quite a lot of the youths, despite the fact that the youth are 60% of the population, is only 12% that registered. That's another dimension that people doesn't know. Even the opposition itself that wants to come to power, they're always disorganized. There's disunity. And that's why they said the state capture. The state knows how to divide and rule. So election itself is not a panacea, but it's like a condition that any regime or any government needs to put in place before a government can come into place. So we tend to see that more often than not, it's a mixture that the opposition can come in but that will not be a situation where it will be a destruction of the fabric if one party does not come. So what we tend to see is that the SADC here needs to play a role, where ECOWAS has played a role over there in Senegal, I need to say. It's not easy as people tend to see. So there's a role for the regional economic organization to play. Then there's a role also for the various state institutions to play. That is, the three executive arms, they should guide. But election per se is the only way that we have seen now.
Okay, no, thank you very much. So we are condemned to elections. We are condemned to elections, whatever they yield for us. But let me come to you, Dr. Edigeji, because one of the big discontents associated with elections is the fact that regardless of who you vote into office, citizens don't seem to see any substantial change in their circumstances. That's what led scholars like Thandika Mkandawire to talk about choiceless democracies in Africa. You've been in government, and you've also been a student of politics. Your book on democracy without development was actually quite a hit when it came out. For those who might be interested in looking at it after the session. I read this book when it came out a few years ago, and it was very, it made the rounds. What is the problem with democracy, as seen from the experience on a continental scale? And do we see that as being also a challenge in the context of South Africa? You've watched Africa, you've heard of the apathy of voters, even of the young people who are not really themselves very keen anymore on participating as such in the democratic process based on the statistics on voter turnout. What is the problem?
Thank you, Professor Olukoche, and thank you, colleagues. When Africans go to the polling station, they go and vote, not because they like your face or not. It is because of the expectation that democracy will lead to development. And I think it is in that spirit that in 1994, for example, in South Africa, when we saw across the country, people were, and across the globe, people were glued to their TV, watching millions of South Africans queue to vote. It was a vote for hope, that their vote will lead to development. But unfortunately, across the continent, and the data shows that, when you look at the data, one of the things that you notice quite clearly is the development deficit. And in some cases, and across the continent, one can say this, you are having a regression, developmental regression. Poverty had increased on the continent. You look at the data. Inequality has increased. Majority of our people are unemployed. Underemployment is also on the rise. So what is the problem? Because I'm an institutionalist, that's where I will come from. Okay, there are two things. First, the leadership that emerged across the continent, in general, they seem to lack what I call the ideology of developmental nationalism. As a consequence, they are unable to harness the resources of the continent to develop, both human and natural resources. Till today, Nigeria still imports, it exports crude oil and imports refined petrol. South Africa, yeah, we are unable to really harness our gold. So we export the raw product and import the refined product at a higher rate. So first, it is the question of ideology. What is the vision? Where do they want to take the continent to go? And do they implement anything they said they want to implement consistently? The answer is no. Then I think the second point from an institutional perspective is, and thank God we are in a school of governance, the governance issues that is the focus. Those governance indicators actually did not lead to development. So the main focus is on election, rule of law, and all of that. That is not what leads to development. The Asia countries have taught us the first thing that you do, establish a national planning commission, or what we call a super ministry, that we have a broad overview and be able to come up with a national development that is implemented consistently over time. Then secondly, you need to be able, the engine room of every government is the civil servant. If you have a career civil servant that are well rewarded, they will keep to the rules. They can tell a president that, Mr. President, sir, you can't do this because the rules don't allow that. But the recruitment process on the continent into the civil service is mostly through patronage, who you know. And in South Africa, and that is one of the worries, is we have a civil service where the civil service, the Public Service Commission is not responsible for recruitment. It is done by interviews. There is this saying that it is imperative to have a merit-based civil service. Everybody must take the same examination. So that is the first prerequisite. On the continent, that maybe besides Mauritius, which I have studied, besides Mauritius, the recruitment process is a problem. So we do not get the very best in our society into the civil service. So let me give an example. By the time I did my research in 2014, it was only 5% of South African civil servants that have 4-year degrees and above. Equivalent in China, it was 92%. Brazil, 50%. Malaysia, 50%. So we have a civil service that are not qualified, basically. So I think let me end there.
Okay, thank you very much. You are bringing us closer into the South African context of the elections taking place on the continent. But before we dig deeper into that context, let me invite you, Palesa, to reflect on what these elections could possibly mean for the African continent.
Thanks, Prof. You know, I think I'm struggling with the elections of South Africa, what they could be meaning for the continent, because I think South Africa turning 30 in its democracy journey, and of course being looked upon as a country that has had significant achievements. But also at the same time, and my reason for being so a bit worried is that it is the youngest democracy in the continent. And South Africa at its 30th now, there are those signs of erosion, particularly the institutions that support this democracy. South Africa has regressed, I think, in the recent democracy index as well, particularly mentioning some few elements, the rigged elections and so on and on. I really do not have evidence of such, but reading from the reports. But at the same time, when we see the erosion of these critical institutions and also studying that erosion within the context of understanding that in other countries there are no Chapter 9 institutions, for instance. I think for me, I would want to reverse the question to say, how can we best protect these Chapter 9 institutions, strengthen them? Second layer to that, also when we think about the elections monitoring bodies, so in this case, let's say the SADC EOMs and others, other EOMs in other regions. Oftentimes, these election observing missions, they would pronounce that the elections have been fair and, sometimes shy away from the credibility process. I think when we endorse elections that we know very well, for instance, the DRC one, where we see our president celebrating and endorsing those, the elections of DRC. When we also have the situation in Zimbabwe and we see our president endorsing that, how can we hold, or what stops us, or what are the hindrances that now begin to say to us that our country might also be facing that direction? Because clearly our president has endorsed his peers. So I think for me, it is a challenge if we are going to think of South Africa post-30, because yes, rightfully so, we can think of this 30-year-old nation that is still in the journey of being built. But what happens when we are at 35 and we have reached our growth span? Thank you.
I'm trying my best not to be pessimistic. Because as you said, the democratic journey is a very long one. And from a purely comparative perspective, one of the things which I find still very interesting with the South African context as an observer is the relative independence of the Election Commission. It is staffed and run by some of the best professionals that I've come across, and I've been around for a little while. Since I usually say that since Afari Jan, the founding chair of the Election Commission of Ghana, we haven't had a better election manager than the current chair of the IEC, Mosotho Moepea, who has been preceded also by equally formidable people. I think of Brigalia Bam, for example, and you just had to respect her. And I've seen her calling politicians to order in the way in which I don't see in many other African countries. The second is the judiciary, and the fact that the judiciary is not only reasonably resourced, no institution gets all the money that it needs to function, but it's reasonably resourced, and you don't see any direct signs of executive interference in trying to manipulate the judicial process. Do you share that view, Remy, as an observer from a distance, that there are still institutions that serve as a bulwark for protecting the democratic gains of the post-1994 period in South Africa as compared to what you've seen, for example, in Guinea-Bissau or even in Senegal, for that matter?
Thanks. I think you've rightly said it. One of the things that I tend to understand with my experience in ECOWAS is that the institutions need to be strengthened. And where the institutions are strong, not necessarily a strong individual, the institutions of some of the member states in Africa are very strong in terms of integrity. With South Africa, as you rightly said, after Afarijan of Ghana, whom I've worked with, I think the next is here, and then Jega's time is also recognized in terms of Nigeria. However, the issue of state capture has already made some people to believe that irrespective of whether the institution is strong or not, that the executive arm still have some power. And there's occasions where we've seen, just like the moderator said, where the chair of the executive, the word at times is very, some they will say Independent Electoral Commission, some they will say Independent National Electoral Commission, in some they will say Electoral Commission. The word there is the word independent. How independent are this commission itself? It all depends on how they are elected there. Is it the chair? Is the chair being elected or the members being elected by the president? And what constitutes the membership? Are they people of integrity? Are they people that are neutral? And before they come to the position, have they been well established in their profession? This goes a long way to say how credible it would be. And that's where the position of the so-called Regional Economic Committee, just like my other colleagues have said, also comes to question. Both the Independent Commission, as they call it, as well as the regional economic bodies and the continental, they also have to be a sort of guiding areas. They have to have guiding principles. Just like ECOWAS now, they have certain principles based on that even if the government wants to sabotage the system, there is a way that they can be curtailed. For example, 6 months to the election, you are not allowed to touch the Constitution. But we tend to have in some areas, as I would say, where it is what we call in judiciary or what we call in legal terms, that the deal has been done before they interfere. So we tend to see like the case of South Africa now is good. But what about the executive arm itself? Will they obey? Will they concur to what is written and what they have adhered to? Is another question. And we talk about the issues. We all know the issues that is on ground now, that even made people to think ANC will not. But for the Independent Electoral Commission, they are a bit independent, they have the integrity, but more often than not, the populace itself, they don't have the confidence in the system again. In fact, generally in Africa, I could tell you, we made there what they call the barometer, Afrobarometer. It just came out from the CDD Ghana, and they look at the general trend in Africa, and they realize that the sense of the political efficacy of the people, which tend to be high, has come down now because of the promises both the incumbent, the ruling government, or the opposition tend to do. So when you look at it, the independent, it needs to be independent, but the judiciary, as you've rightly said, it needs to be independent. That's where they have the three separation of power. But how are they doing their work? Yes, the executive arm supposed to be there, while the legislative arm needs to provide the oversight. But what we tend to see at times is that the executive arm tend to even dictate. We have seen the cases of Mali, we've seen the cases of some other countries where the executive arm says no election. And then they say, so it's like relative, just like you said. It is true, some doing the job as it's supposed to be, looking at what the legal documents stipulates, as well as their conscience. But the issue of political will on the part of the executive is a point to also talk about.
Okay, thank you very much. So there are so many discontents with the administration of elections on the continent. And we are not going to be hoodwinked by whatever names the election management bodies are called, independent or not. As somebody who is a professor of practice, you live in South Africa, Dr. Edigeji, do you see a danger of contagion? Do you see a danger of contagion in the same way as Palesa was reflecting upon? There are elections that are not exactly wholesome that have taken place elsewhere on the continent. And we have seen leadership in this country celebrating with the victors of those elections, right? Which is a bit worrisome from the point of view of Palesa. We've heard about election commissions that are not really what they claim to be, and executive interference in the process. Is there anything that you see on the horizon that gives you concerns that there could be a possible contagion effect in South Africa?
Yes, I think, thank you, Prof. My two colleagues actually articulated my concerns and my views and my analysis. I think in addition to that, besides what they have said, which is true, it is to go behind the scene if you have been involved in an election. And I think the South African one, I should say, is relatively more transparent on the continent, relatively more peaceful, which is something that gives one hope, relatively more free and fair. I don't think I have read or have seen anywhere where maybe during the day of election or leading to the election, people were killed or there was massive violence. So that is a plus for South Africa. But as I have seen the various analysis and scenarios and all of that, I don't know whether I subscribe to all of them. I need to see more statistics and to be able to make a conclusion that the ANC will not get 50% plus one. But with that in the horizon, what will the ANC resort to? Will the contagion effect that you mentioned, will they learn lessons, which is negative lessons, from the rest of the continent? It is something that we should all watch out for, and when the need arises, we need to be able to speak up. But one of the things that always interests me, and every time I see AU election mission, you see the report, ECOWAS, SADC, and you see the report. Citizens are saying this is what is going on. We are seeing people being killed. We are seeing the election ballot paper being snatched. Then you said, yes, the election is free and fair. That is very, it's something that, we should watch out for, that contagion effect. But I think another thing that we need to put on the table is the role of money. The South African one is relatively, at least from what we read in the papers, the financing of political parties is relatively more transparent. But as someone who has been in the field. And what you see, you don't even see 99% of what goes on and how much is spent on election. You don't see that. A night of the election or leading to the election, you will see vehicles with loads of cash. It is something that, so we have to really, moving forward on the continent, the financing of political parties needs to be more transparent. At the moment, that is not, that is not the case. And that relates also, let me bring this in, the role of the security agency. We need to watch out for that, because during election, they are compromised. They are compromised. They look away when various misdeeds are being done. So the integrity of our election are being compromised. We hope that South Africa will not learn such lessons, that it will be a beacon of hope. In 1994, the continent see it as a beacon of hope. It has slid somewhat, but we still hope that some of these sectional institutions and that the manner in which the members of the judiciary are being appointed, that we will keep to that so that we can have relatively, I use the word relatively independent judiciary. Lastly, Prof, the role of the media, it is something that we actually need to be worried about across the continent. Is the African media independent? I will beg to differ. I think across the continent, what is said in Nigeria, that brand envelope, is compromising the way they report on election. So moving forward, to have free, fair election, the media needs to relate the orientation. We need a different culture. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you very much. I think that comforts me a little. 1994 was a year of massive jubilation around the world, and not least across our continent, to see the inauguration of a free South Africa. And I think many of us were old enough at that time to be able to celebrate that year as a victory, not just for the people of South Africa, but for all of us who are freedom-loving human beings around the world. And that idea of South Africa as an example, one of the celebrated examples of its role and significance, is also the Constitution of South Africa, which, if you pick up any literature, it would immediately be obvious that it's one of the best constitutions in the world. But at the end of the day, people don't eat constitutions. And people worry about issues of unemployment, issues of poverty, issues of inequality. Those same three dragons that have undermined the integrity of politics in the rest of Africa. Is there any room for cooperation among African countries in the context of democratic politics to work together effectively to attack these common problems that undermine the quality of governance? Palesa.
Thanks, Prof. I think there is room for that. So I firstly want to just touch on these three factors where I'm also sort of trying to support the point that my colleague Prof made about the Afrobarometer, where you are picking up that from Afro, and because I'm using Afrobarometer because it will lead to the answer, because Afrobarometer represents various countries, therefore various voices in the continent as a collective measure, if I may say so. You find that there are these nuances around voter submissions in terms of, you will find in a country where they say they feel that they voted freely, but then as you go along the survey, there's a fear that, yes, we have voted freely, but then I fear that my name might be known by the leading political party or whatever the situation may be. And also there is this participation of youth as well that was submitted earlier on in terms of, in the South African context, 60% of the population being young, but only 12% of that registering for the elections. And the interference of the external strong institutions in the continent. So I think that collaboration, it's quite, for it to be successful, we have to be intentional and critical about, also we can also include the role of media as well. We have to be critical in terms of understanding, as we look at this pot that has all these multiple factors, but the citizen at the center of it still being uncertain about the power of elections and the decision making and the rule of law thereof, or if the party they voted for does come to rule. At what point do they begin to collaborate? I think as a continent, we can really either choose to collaborate from the regional economic cooperation level, whereby, because I think at the REC level already with SADC and ECOWAS, etc., being represented there needs to be a forum that should be able to independently, but also bring in the state institutions to sort of engage and surface out the issues that the citizens might have displayed in some of these barometers. So I think it's quite important for us to, first of all, make use of the evidence in the form of those statistics that we participate in these surveys, but also as we conceptualize or rethink or reconceptualize democracy, understand how do we, particularly going forward, how do we begin to say our democracy or participation in democracy is maturing. At this point in time, I think most of the time we measure the maturity of our democracy by how our countries are calm as we go on, or how we manage to move from different descriptions, whether autocratic, now hybrid, or whatsoever. And I think as much as now we are getting to understand these variables that indicate to us that whether our democracy is maturing, our ways of electing is maturing, the multi-partyism is thriving, I think that allows us to have that collaboration. That will be one. And I think, Prof, also as a way of just rethinking about this collaboration. I think if we are looking at, I'm quite concerned about the situation in the Great Lakes, for instance, where now France is exiting the West, but now it's strengthening its relationship with Sudan. What are the lessons that we can learn from these countries that are expelling France? Because that represents that collaboration. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll turn it to the audience. If you have questions, please start preparing your questions. But before I call on participants, let me turn to you, Remy, because you've been, 18 years with the Economic Community of West African States, which is considered to be one of the most successful examples of regional economic cooperation in Africa. In fact, in the SADC region, many people look at the interventions of ECOWAS, not just with regard to economic matters, but also with regards to political issues, as an example that ought to be emulated. The suspension of members where coups have taken place, and so on and so forth. And yet, at the same time, ECOWAS seems to be collapsing under the weight of what I would call a mandate overstretch that seems to be undermining its integrity and capacity. You've repeatedly said that SADC should play an important role in following the elections in South Africa in the same way as ECOWAS does with regard to the elections in West Africa. But what lesson will you give, will you share with SADC not to repeat the mistakes that ECOWAS has made in regard to those countries that have decided to pull out to suspend their membership or cancel their membership of ECOWAS because of the sanctions that ECOWAS imposed on them?
Thank you. You've rightly said there are actually some lessons. But however, just to follow up from the last speaker, you did mention areas of cooperation where the leaders, you should recall that in 2000, early 2000, we have the I don't know what the Western call them, we have the people like the Ethiopian leader then, Meles, and then Kigali, Paul Kagame, and then one of them, there are three then. One thought Obasanjo would come in, but no. But Wad, later, and Obasanjo, they came. These are leaders that when they are there, they also, even Tambo Mbeki here was the third one. They fought for representation of the Africans, even at the General Assembly level, the UN, and they put the position across. And they formed the issue of NEPAD in West Africa. They formed the other group here in South Africa, here, APRM. Yeah, and then in ECOWAS, we have what they call the ECONEC, ECOWAS Network Election Commission. These are groups, they do what they call the peer review. It was established when I was director there. It means, in essence, despite the fact that Nigeria, the supremo giant there, we do call people from KVAD the Electoral Commission. Despite the small size, they are forefront in terms of integrity and others. They also send them to learn lessons and lessons to be shared among them, lessons learned. And also at the regional level, as you just said, there's what they call division of labor now. The AU now sees that the RECs are the building blocks, and as such, they should have at least 2 meetings every year, one at the technical level and one at the head of organization level. So those are the mechanisms are there. It is the implementation at times that is the problem. And the monitoring. Most often we just set it up, but it's not being monitored. So there is a need for effective evaluation and monitoring. Then to come to the lessons that can be learned by SADC from there, one of the great assets that ECOWAS has got is in terms of the founding fathers. There is that the political will. I would not want to go into the epistemology of it. You do recall that just like any other organization, it is set up for economic integration. But when they realized that things are moving, there are intra-state conflict as well as interstate with the issue of Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea-Bissau that time. I'm talking of 1990 then. They used the forefront, despite the fact that Nigeria, the supreme leader, just like South Africa here, the role they're supposed to be playing, SADC, Nigeria is playing there. I will make a comparative. There are occasions that you have to sacrifice to make sure that you put the leadership role there and then provide the resources as well as the manpower. That's what they did then, which gave them a lot of leverage. That's one way. Then the other way in which they can also give in ECOWAS was that the founding fathers then, they realized then that there is a need to put the state before their own personal and selfish aggrandizement. The third lesson from what you said about the two issues. Those countries that are trying to say they are moving out of ECOWAS itself, there's a rule of procedure, just like the EU, like Britain moved out of EU 1 year. They are still under that 1 year grace, whether to change. But I think where most of those countries came out full force was that they believed that ECOWAS was not fully involved in their security issues when they were being attacked. But however, I will also want to say, not because I worked, there's what they call the action group, what they call the action plan for ECOWAS there, whereby member states are asked to contribute. The ECOWAS standby force is there. That's another area where you also have the brigades here as well. But how effective? People often think is a standing army, but it needs to be troop-contributing countries. You have to pledge loyalty. But the good thing ECOWAS also did, which I quote, the case of Mali in 2013, it takes even the United Nations 90 days to gather forces together to go to any, but it took them 45 days to send those countries there. But however, the issue of finance is also there. It means the country has to pre-finance and then they will have to pay. So those are examples, but the most important thing is the legal framework. That's what also ECOWAS. There are a lot of legal framework. We have 12 of them. I don't want to go into. There's one we call the mechanism on conflict prevention, management, resolution, security, and peacekeeping. If you look at it, the first one is prevention. Yeah. Then the other one is management. And the third one is when it really comes, when there's the position. Then there's the supplementary protocol, which you also need there, which I've checked all other. That one talk about the convergence principles, whereby before elections, what are the things to look into? After elections, what are the things to look into? It stated clearly the separation of power, and also stated the time you cannot touch or manipulate the election. But I just mentioned something like that. Some of the head of state are faster, or some of the member states are faster than some of these regional organizations. They will have changed it possibly 2 years. And when you're about to move in, they will tell you, what are you coming to do? So that's why I call it fait accompli. So you will see them telling you that already our legislative arm, they've already ratified. And then what are you coming to do? So that's where at times the answer I do. So the regional leadership, the hegemony, like South Africa, have to play a role. They are looking onto you. Likewise, like Nigeria, they are looking onto them, but at times you tend to see that the executive arm often make things difficult, but there must be the political will. Okay. I think that's important.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. A very quick one from you, Omano, then I'll invite questions.
You know, for those of you who are Christians, there's a section in the Bible, a verse in the Bible that says, God said judgment will begin in his own house. So I want to reflect on us here. We, Researchers Academy, we provide advisory to ministers, head of states, election body. How many of us have fought right when we engage particularly with head of states? And I'll give one or two experience. One head of state invited me, and he wanted to know what his country can do to become a democratic developmental state. So in the course of the discussion, we were discussing the election. His party won the election by 98%. Because he wanted me to be forthright, he invited me, and I should be forthright. So I told him, we cannot say this is a democracy where one political party get 98%. And where also a particular ethnic group, minority ethnic group, is dominant in government. So he said, so Omano, what should we do? I say, begin to liberalize the political dispensation gradually. Because if you don't, particularly when you leave, when you go, the place will implode. Unfortunately, what I discussed with him, he passed away, he left. After he passed away, the country went into a civil war. There is a country here where all of us want to go to attend conferences. Are we being forthright when we engage with that leader? Okay. So that is a point that we academic, we also have a role to play in the electoral process by ensuring that our analysis is driven by science.
The responsibility of the scholar and of the academic. May I open up? Are there any questions before we continue with the second phase? Yes. Okay. Let me start with my colleague. Just say your name for the benefit of the panel. And
okay, thank you very much, Prof. This is Frank Lekaba from the School of Governance. How many questions can you ask, Prof? Because I've an exam here.
You can take one for starters, then we can come back.
Okay. I think management of elections in the continent is, from the level of the AU, even the regional economic communities, has been neglected to institutions at a national level. When you look at Kenya, where officials of the election management body distance themselves from the results, some officials, and you look at the subsequent intervention of the AU, worrisome. Same story with Angola, where officials themselves of the election management body distance themselves from the election results. And the AU, or the regional economic community, looks like it's paralyzed. So I don't know if this has to do with ratification of legal instruments, Prof, that you just spoke about, or lack of teeth from the AU and the regional economic communities with regard to, but specifically on the elections. With the coups, they are very decisive. There's expulsion immediately and all of that. But with regards to elections, there seems to be a lack of teeth in my, I don't know, and I'm saying I don't know if it's because of lack of ratification by member states of these legal instruments, or capacity of the AU institutions to act. So that is a comment, it's not a question. So now here's my question, Prof.
Okay.
Yesterday I listened to the Minister of Digital, I forgot the portfolio, and he was saying South Africans must be worried should the ANC get out of power. Because the ANC seems to be the only party that understands the post-1994 edifice that we have here, the political edifice we have, and the foundations of it. I don't know, I'm not saying I confirm or I agree with him, but I don't know if, as observers of the continent, should there be such a worry in the continent as to the seismic changes that might take place? Should the continent, people of the continent, worry about that possibility, and why? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, that's going to be an important part of the second part of the conversation. So I will encourage the panel to warehouse it. You don't need to respond to that immediately, but do react to the comment, because I would also like to put that important question in the context of what happens when long-ruling incumbents, especially in a context of liberation, leave the political scene and opposition parties come in. The example of India, I think, is salutary in this regard. But there are also other examples like Mexico, where the Constitutional Party was in power since the Mexican Revolution, more or less, until the 1990s, dawn of the new millennium. So we would like to tackle that in a fulsome way. But your comment is also important. It should elicit a response immediately. Wale? Yes. Yes, a microphone here, and then I'll take.
Microphone? Can I use my voice? It's quite loud. Thanks very much, Prof, and thanks to the panelists. Wale Olale is my name. My question is really what you said, and that's what really is triggering it for me. You said we are stuck with elections, because that's the way it goes now, and that's the truth. But again, what we've seen with democracies is what Professor Kabele said, that democracy is catching cold and citizens are sneezing. And the reason for that is because of some of the practices that we are seeing. We are seeing executive coups on the continent, military coups, the whole question around the social economic conditions of the citizens, also part of it. We have instruments on the continent which are not effective. AGDAG, I have the privilege of doing an assessment in Sierra Leone, trying to predict some of the factors that contribute to military takeovers in that particular country. So my question, for me, I suppose the question here is what I would like us to reflect on is how do we begin to build resilience within our democracies on the continent? Because we've seen the fragility of the system. Thank you.
Very important question. How do we build democratic resilience in the face of the many discontents of our experience so far? You bring the microphone to the front here. I'll call her. Yeah, I've seen you. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, panelists, for your presentation. I think Frank stole my main question.
Okay.
But my second question is about the responsibility of the scholar, as you had mentioned. I think while we know as academics that we have a responsibility to influence and shape the discourses and the practices in our continent, in our respective countries in the continent, the environment to carry that out has not been extremely conducive, in the sense that, you know, there are certain countries, without putting anyone on a pedestal, where you walk into a TV station and give a commentary around presidential candidates, and, you know, what happens after that interview is, we'll see what happens after that. And so how do we, where most countries in the continent are, 50 plus years and above, how do we at this point, at this old age, begin to rethink, create a conducive environment that allows for scholarly engagement, that allows for people within the civil society organizations to have a healthy participation in how we shape development and governance in the continent?
Okay, thank you very much. Important questions. Freedom of engagement is not exactly free. Carries its own cost.
Yes. Are you on me, Prof?
Yes, please.
Thank you so much. Frank and my colleagues, Frank and Ikemini, they've already, stole my questions. You did. But let me ask the third one so that I don't have to repeat. I got in when you were talking a bit. I think your panelists were also engaging on regional trade and of course issues on ECOWAS. And I was just thinking, is really there an appetite within our continent? We're talking elections, and of course regional trade is important. Of course, the African Continental Free Trade Area is known to be a landmark, or at least they're telling us it's a landmark. But is there really an appetite for harmonizing trade policies, regulations, because I'm thinking, I mean, this thing has been ratified when 2018, of course, they are saying it's pre-COVID, then COVID came. But I don't know, it seems like a very gradual, too gradual even. So must we wake up, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, to shake us up so that there's some rapidness, at least, in it? Or are we impatient? Are we?
Okay, 60 years on, we cannot be accused of impatience. What an important question on the interface of development and governance on the continent. That's Dr. Edigeji. Please, the gentleman on the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Prof. My name is Ademola Ayodele from WBS. I want to react to the question that talked about the lesson that the SADC should learn or must learn from what happened in ECOWAS as regards the pulling out of some countries because of the coup and the likes. Prof, I think before we look at the lesson we should learn or SADC should learn from it, we need to consider what is the major problem in all these countries. What are the roles of ECOWAS? If they have problem and ECOWAS have actually played their roles as a continent or as a region, I want to believe that this country will not pull out. Another thing is we also need to consider the interest of that country. The United Nations, somebody was commenting yesterday from, I think, Ghana. He said he's not going to blame the country pulling out because it seems ECOWAS are just trying to force United Nations agenda on ECOWAS countries. And the truth of the matter is we cannot forget that we're Africa. Whether we are SADC, whether we are ECOWAS, our interest must be number one priority to us. These Western countries, they can't survive without Africa. We know that. So we need to concentrate on what is the problem. I remember the 14 principle of Joseph Henry Fayot. Before you solve a problem, you must know the causes of that problem. What is the root of that problem? It is when we know that, then the SADC will be able to learn. If there is any such issue within SADC, then SADC community will be able to know the right approach to follow. Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you very much, Dele. I'll come back to the panel, and Palesa, feel free to pick any of the issues you want to.
Thanks, Prof. and the audience. I'm not going to respond, but I'm quite intrigued by the question on the role of scholarship, and I think it reminds me of a position of Claude Ake in terms of are we going to speak for academics and why not the rest of the citizens and so on. So I'm just really mulling on it. But I think when it comes to the issues around economic and trade development, as one of the audience posed there, I think the issue of, first of all, we must acknowledge that trade is happening. It's happening at a really slow minor scale. But also, I think it's really those corporations or entities, private sector entities, that do have that power to facilitate or participate in the trade exchanges. And I think at the same time, the state or the states need to be quite robust in driving the trade exchange as far as AfCFTA is concerned. When you look at South Africa, for instance, and perhaps also I'm not reading adequately with regards to the kinds of deals they are championing. But you know, for instance, South Africa pursuing its economic opportunities or diplomacy in South Sudan due to oil interest there, and particularly in this case, the elections become quite important for South Sudan to achieve them, because then they will herald another era of the bilateral relations. So I think really on us linking the elections to development, we have to start seeing that data or information, or feel the sense of the trade opening up, because if we are still meddling on or dwelling on issues of inequalities, or if we are failing to reduce the inequality gaps, then we are not going to see the benefits of AfCFTA at a meaningful level, which is really where the distribution can benefit the continent at the citizen level. Thanks, Prof.
Thank you very much, Professor Ajibel.
Thanks. I think with respect to the question on management, comment on management of elections, you rightly said it, that regardless, that election itself, as we mentioned, that needs to be monitored, and then the role of the regional economic that the role of the regional economic organizations has to be looked into. And then you did mention the ANC, the rallying force, which the moderator said we are coming to that. What about if the opposition comes through, and then example, but I think the moderator has told us to pipe down that. And then how do we begin to build up, you were saying after 50 years is enough to create a conducive environment to have a healthy participation for people. I mean, we tend to see that even the countries of the developed countries that we are following, America, it took them years to get to this stage. I think we also need some patience. I know we can run out of steam and patience because we are youth. Nevertheless, we also need to understand that there are like the 350 years of apartheid. Just to within 30 years, you think it can easily be cleared away. But nevertheless, as for next round, there's been the issue of inclusivity, participation, and then despite the fact that we are even developing countries, we've seen that some of our members, like here, have been able to join the BRICS, which with China being there as the greatest partner, most of them have even moved out. Some also do what they call intra-regional trade, but another question is that we tend to look at it when we do the formula that the relation with the outsider is more than within the country. And you don't blame. Those days when we were in school, we did what they call the center of the center, center of the periphery, and the periphery of the periphery, if you remember, those of you here. So there's tendency, it's in our politics, there's tendency for South Africa to always want to trade with the center of the metropolis than trading with the Zimbabwean and over there. They will do it on cosmetic. But usually, as you've said, national interest matters. But at the same time, the regional leader often sacrifice. Then we talk about, my sister talked about after, not that there's not been trading pattern, there's been, but there's what they call the convergence principles as well. There are other things when there's the issue of harmonization, the integrity, and then the coordination as well. There's been some harmonization, but I want to also to tell you that where there's also a connection between when some of these countries don't have political stability, it will affect the economic growth. So peace, development, stability, they all go together. Where there's no stability, there cannot be progress. So what we tend to see is that some of the countries are still going through those issues that I think the next one. So when those issues are there, it means their concentration will be on those problems within. And we often say foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy. So outsiders, they will also look at them to make sure that before we trade with these people, they have a very conducive environment. And then countries that doesn't have a stable, they will not be able to have foreign direct investment. So it's a correlation. It goes hand in hand, irrespective of how we look at it. The issues in the country itself or in the continent is also like a mirage that we need to be clearing ourselves, and we need some regional leaders to take that role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Edigeji.
Yes, thank you, Prof. I think let me take your question around that the continent, we don't have conducive environment for scholars to engage. The Nkrumah, Mandela, Azikiwe, and all those that participated in the independence struggle, they were prepared to pay a price. The conducive environment for independence was not there. They took it upon themselves to pay a price, including the late Mugabe or Samuel Uyoma. So first, one of the things that we scholars have to do is that we must be prepared to pay a price. Nothing comes free. There's an opportunity cost for everything that we do. Nobody will create the enabling environment for you. It is our responsibility as African scholars to organize and contribute to deepening democracy and ensure that Africans have democratic dividends. So that's the first point. The second point is, let your work be driven by science. If it is driven by science, like there's no book I've written, including this one, right? We find a way to get it to the leadership of Nigeria. And some people were asking me, Omano, you're in government, and you're writing a book with a title like this. And this thing now said, leave the title, look at the analysis. If the data that are in there are wrong, I'm prepared to apologize. But as long as the data are correct, and some of the data are from official sources, I was very confident to get the book out to the leadership of Nigeria. In South Africa, I did the same when I was here. Almost every book I wrote, including when Mbeki was the president, I sent copies to him and to most ministers. And when I engage with them privately, my engagement is based on the science. When we had COVID vaccine, it is not something that, it was obvious. We had COVID and you needed a vaccine. So once you project yourself as not being partisan, but you want the country to develop and your work is driven by science, there will be this mutual respect that, yes, he can be critical, but what he's saying is true. So I think that is how I find a way to engage. Please, let me also say, at times you will pay a price. You pay a career price, okay? Don't think you pay a career prize. But the question you have to ask is, are you prepared to die for something? If you don't want to die for something, you will die for nothing. So you have to make the choice. I think that is the point. Then around this issue of ECOWAS, I'm just reflecting as we think about some of these countries. Are they truly independent? Are they truly independent? And the speech by President Faye before he was elected clearly set that out. And most of these countries, Mali, Senegal, and I think Burkina Faso, they are trying to say, yes, our previous leaders, they did their best, but we are not where we should be. We need to be truly independent. And until that thing is resolved, that issue of particularly the Francophone Africans being truly independent, ECOWAS will continue to wobble, make one step forward, two steps backward. It is something that we need. And for you scholars, you also have a role to play. What are we teaching the younger generation? Are we giving them a paradigm that do not reflect the African reality? Because it is written in Washington, so it is correct, and we must parrot that. Or we articulate. You listen to the current leader of Burkina Faso, and he was quite clear. We need a new paradigm of education for the continent to be free.
Okay, thank you very much. Indeed, a new paradigm is needed in the context of acute uncertainty. I don't think I've seen, in all of my experience, so much doubt and uncertainty on a global scale than we are experiencing today in different parts of the world. And as the elections approach in South Africa, my sense is that one of the concerns outside of South Africa in the rest of the continent is what will happen if the ANC were to be out of power. Have you thought about that? Have you reflected on it?
Yeah, I think should ANC be out of government as a leading governing party, it's going to be quite interesting. And my hope is that if ANC does go out of government, we will not experience distractions from the potential incoming political party. I think as much as ANC has come out clearly to say they are not going for a coalition, I'm sure that there is a certain element of them, of their gut that says we have to be ready for that coalition. I do not see ANC being taken out fully, of course, into this government. But when that coalition does come, and we have to put now the test of the coalition in South Africa and the test of the multipartyism as we have been in it, but then now we would be facing with seeing it fully. It's going to be interesting as to how also the external factors affect that change. Because as much as political parties can go with their ideologies, what informs their manifestos and what they promise and how they look at the mechanisms of delivering, even if it's a portion of their promise. But then that does not erase the fact that the external factors may have to now be seen in their full mighty, particularly because we don't know this coalition what it will bring if the other coalition parties may not have a model of what a state will have to, or how a state will have to function. Because as it stands now, even in under ANC, we are still battling with understanding, why is the state relegating some of its functions to private sector. So I think that's where we have to put our minds and energies to advise or to think of South Africa under state functions being under certain institutions that might not be of the state. Mm-hmm. And I think also with that change, as we think about it, understanding that South Africa are currently talking about accountability of politicians, etc., and piloting certain programs there and there. We can look at the current bill that was just signed about 24 hours ago. There is a huge contestation. I think as much as whether it's coming in as a political stunt, but there is a risk in introducing the signing of that bill just on the eve of elections.
Okay, I'll still stay with you, Palesa, because you are from the HSRC. I'm from AISA, the Africa Institute of South Africa. The last 30 years, we have known South Africa's role in Africa for certain things. It was actually during the years, the Mbeki years, that we completed the transition from the OAU to the AU, with the launching of the AU in Durban, 2000, formally. And all of that fed into the idea of an African renaissance. Continental Africa has been freed from colonial domination, and the political struggle for independence has been won. Now we need to win the struggle for economic independence. That was the whole idea. And Mbeki was also a champion of the African Renaissance. And remember his famous speech, "I am an African," which resonated across the continent as probably one of the most important speeches of the 20th century. Thirdly, Mbeki, Obasanjo, Wade, and Bouteflika, 4 African presidents, championed NEPAD, which is headquartered here in Midrand, to bolster that push for a continental economic liberation and renaissance, whilst promoting the idea of African economic community and integration. And I can cite many other examples. Peer review mechanism, APRM, which is also headquartered, hosted by South Africa. The Pan-African Parliament that came into being, hosted here also in South Africa. I cite these examples really just to push you a bit, to say, will this world, this African world as seen from South Africa, change after the 29th of May? Is there enough domestic consensus in South Africa to say that there are certain pillars of an Africa policy that will remain regardless of which party or coalitions come into power or stay in power after the 29th of May?
Thanks, Prof. I think there is that direction. I think if you're looking at, I will take, for instance, the position of ANC and EFF. I think they're quite clear in terms of their commitment to the Africa agenda. So basically the African policies, continued support to the integration of Africa through its cooperation. And I think also as certain policies such as the NDP, for instance, they do reiterate that South Africa in a better Africa is quite an important role for a developed South Africa or a liberated Africa. So for as long as South Africa continues to see that in its foreign policy, that South Africa cannot be seen as a better position if its neighboring countries are not in a better position, I think there is hope in ensuring that we can drive those policies that push towards an integration. And I think at the same time, Prof, there are quite initiatives in the country that are nudging us towards the economic diplomacy, the infrastructure projects that South Africa is driving through the AFCFTA, having the Wamkelemene being in the AFCFTA. I think having a South African representative there who is there to ensure that South Africa can drive its foreign policy aspirations, but also being stationed in another country to ensure that that integration element, particularly human and institution, human to human, institution to institution, and country to country elements can be heralded by those policies is quite a critical stance of South Africa to play towards the integrated Africa and achieving the economic diplomacy or sovereignty at some point.
Okay, no, thank you very much. It's optimistic because when I read some of the commentaries, for example, about the sending of troops to Eastern Congo, it seems to be divergent voices in the domestic political scene, with some even threatening to bring the boys back home, as it were.
And it's quite a critical area to watch, Prof, because currently, I'm aware that the South African ambassador in the DRC is really mobilizing the private sector to assist with the bilateral responsibility of South Africa in that DRC, particularly in the Eastern DRC, where now failure to contain that situation, all the investments of South Africa in DRC would really experience a massive reversal. So it's quite a development that we need to put our efforts, energies, and resources towards as a matter of urgency. The conflict in that area is not assisting us. The troops in that area, they are also experiencing well-being challenges, mental well-being challenges. You would have read recently that one of them shot himself and then, or shot the colleague and turned the gun on themselves. So I think paying attention, and particularly also with the Rwanda that will go into the elections quite soon, with that long overdue tension in that Eastern DRC. It's something that, and not only South Africa, but I think as SADC, we need to start mobilizing towards interventions in the Eastern DRC.
Okay, and Mozambique, the deployment has been renewed for another cycle, the South African deployment.
Okay, Prof. The scene of being now from the African Institute of South Africa. I think with the renewal there, Prof, of the Mozambique deal there, it's, so I will view it that it's quite concerning that countries that have been liberated for so long, but at this point in time, we are really having these challenges of troops and having to quell the, what you call this? Insurgencies, right? Mozambique, I think, really having enjoyed the camaraderie relations with South Africa, I think at some point, really, if we have to look at these insurgencies and how they are, we are depleting or spending lots of resources towards just trying to contain the situation. At some point, we will have to find an integration strategy between Mozambique and South Africa. We have to move it from just being a camaraderie relationship, but then articulate particularly as to which areas of economic trade are going to be our focus in the next 5 years, or even if it's in the next 3 years. How do we foster some mechanisms of exchange? It cannot be only that we have a disparity of those in Mozambique that are the elites that enjoy the relationship of the two countries, or those who are at the bottom of the those who are in the squalor conditions are the ones that can really be suffering in the peripheries of the economy of South Africa. So I do think it's an area that requires us as South Africa to pay a special attention to, but not only as a result of the insurgencies, but invest critically in driving the economic benefits or the economic diplomacy.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Edigeji. If you were to set an agenda for the government that emerges out of the elections of 29th May, if you were to set an Africa agenda for that government, regardless of who emerges, just to say there are 3 things that you think should be done from the point of view of an Africa policy and strategy, what would those be off the top of your head?
Thank you, Prof. First, let me say that I'm not as pessimistic as most commentators about the outcome of the election. They seem not to be factoring the strategy that the ANC has embarked upon. I think they are taken by surprise about how ANC, particularly the last 1 month or so, have mobilized, and how the House is coming together to ensure that the election is won, how it is targeting its campaign. So I'm not as pessimistic, and also having been somebody on the field, when it comes to such crush time, you know what the media is saying, you know the common narrative, you tailor your campaign strategy to win. So I will still believe that the ANC will win 50% +1. But in the event that that don't happen, I think the continent will be very worried, particularly when we have political parties that are outrightly xenophobic. I would be very worried as a South African and as an African to see Action SA in a coalition government. I think that would be a concern for most for the African continent. Then I think another concern that would be for the African continent. There is a campaign going on that Africans cannot, from the rest of the continent, cannot start small businesses in the township owned by Africans. But we are seeing malls owned by particularly the retail sector, owned by multinationals or by whites, taking over, being dominant in the township. If that will be a serious concern. I think, this is my analysis, that I think what will happen, there will be a pan-African coalition that will emerge. And that even if you have the DA, I'm sorry to say, please, for writing my analysis, even if the DA is part of that, what happened to the National Party when they joined government with the ANC is likely what will happen. So I will not be that, that worried that I think the Pan-African agenda, if the ANC is the dominant party, it is likely going to continue. But at the last point, Prof, I think if the ANC is unable to win 50% plus one, traditional established parties on the continent will be very, very worried. And Senegal has set the example. Are we going to see political parties dominated by youth emerge and basically to say now we are claiming the space? That it is something that the continent have to watch out for. When Faye or Sanko or Julius Malemaye, when they make speeches, the youth of the continent listen. So it is something that traditional old established political parties we have to really think about. So my sense is, this thing happened behind this scene. It's most likely the traditional political parties on the continent will do what they can to ensure that that there is no implosion. But let me also say that I would not be worried if the ANC continue in power. One, if you look at Japan, Japan has been ruled by one political party almost for more than 60 years. Malaysia, it is almost the same thing until there was this disagreement between Mahathir Mohamad and Anwar Ibrahim, when then in Singapore, it is the same thing. So I think what, when we live here, what we should reflect on is how can we ensure that we work to ensure that at least there are maybe one or two dominant party with a clear-cut direction about the future of the country and consequently the continent. That is the way I will approach it.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to see your data that you use for your crystal ball to conclude with so much confidence about the outcome. But yes, I do also share the view that we've seen a lot of surprises on our continent. Sometimes incumbent parties that are expected to not do well actually come out and do better than was predicted. And we sometimes underestimate the electorate to our own peril. As rational, logical thinkers, we assume that if 1 + 1 does not produce 2, it means that the behavior of the electorate will be this way. Well, actually, people have many considerations that they keep in mind. An example was given of a Kenyan young person who supported Martha Karua in coalition with Oginga for the Kenyan elections, the last elections, but was a card-carrying member of another party altogether. I mean, these are, and her reasoning was very simple. Martha Karua has always been my role model. Even if she's not in the party of which I'm a member, I'm voting for that coalition. So there are many complexities that inform the choice of the electorate. And a lot of it sometimes is very local issues, right? Things you are dealing with locally in your community that matter quite a lot. Amilcar Cabral, who was the liberation leader of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde in the 1970s, reminded his fellow revolutionaries that the people are not interested in your ideas and theories. You can go ahead and have debates all day about Marxism, Maoism, Leninism, capitalism, socialism. People just want to progress in life. Don't forget that. That's the baseline. And I think for me, that is what makes the electoral context quite an interesting one, as much for its unpredictability as for the fact that sometimes those of us who consider ourselves to be pundits and experts get completely wrong-footed by the outcomes. I think we'll begin to wind it down here. Wole, I don't know if you got an answer to your question on resilience. You did not get that answer, but if I would hazard a guess, I would argue that it's very clear to all of us by now that a democracy in Africa that does not deliver development outcomes is not going anywhere. It's very clear. It's also the same kind of message. You remember a few years ago, there was a talk of Africa Rising. And you go to the streets of Accra, which was supposed to be the best example of Africa Rising. And you say to Ghanaians on the streets, so Ghana is rising. They say, yeah, on the pages of newspapers. It is rising on the pages of newspapers. But in our pockets, we do not see any Ghana rising. Yeah. Today, a decade after, Ghana is defaulting on its external debt, currency collapsing, citizens being made to take a haircut to pay the domestic debt of the government. You're actually having the government surcharging you to pay for the debt that they had accumulated. And back under the tutelage of the IMF and the World Bank with the structural adjustment program. It's a short period of 10 years. And I think this is, again, the kind of consideration that is central to the argument in your book, Professor Edigeji, on democracy and development, that if we do not achieve the objective of showing that democratic governance can deliver dividends for the populace, and in that process empower citizens in order to be able to exact accountability from governments, from elected leaders, our democratic experiment will continue to suffer immensely. And my own earnest hope as we close is that South Africa's example, to the extent to which it bolsters not only the centrality of the electorate, of the citizen as voter, as the sovereign in the political process, that it would hopefully encourage others who are in the front line of, in the first instance, wanting to even win that right to choose their leaders in a genuine electoral context, but also secondly, to be able to address the issues of social and economic progress that has eluded a lot of people on our continent. We are going to be the poverty capital of the world. We have already become the poverty capital of the world as a continent. Inequality is out of the world for a people whose economies are also still largely informal. 60% informality in some parts, like DRC, most of West Africa. And then you throw inequality into the mix, and effectively, you have a recipe for anarchy. And no matter how good your institutions are in such a context, no matter how beautiful the prose with which you write your constitution is, it will come to nothing and end up in the kinds of movements we have seen in Mali, in Niger, in other places where coups have taken place, and many other places where maybe coups have not taken place, but if they were to happen today, you'll be amazed at the number of people who will take to the streets to jubilate that a military coup has taken place, right? And so it's a very delicate situation for us on the continent, and we hope that the elections in South Africa will go very well, and that the outcome will also reinforce the Pan-African identity of South Africa. I want to thank you for your participation and attention, for those who have been here with us physically, and for those who are online. If you are able to join us at 2:30, we'll be looking at the implications of the elections for the global context, keeping in mind that South Africa is a member of the G20, is a member of BRICS. South Africa has been to ICJ on behalf of humanity to decry what is going on in Gaza. South Africa has been involved in trying to prevent us sleepwalking into a third world war with the proxy conflict between Russia and NATO being fought out in Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And of course, there are interests around the world that are very keenly watching what the outcome will be. Those who want regime change to happen, by all means, and those who are hoping and praying that the incumbent will be able to hold its ground and remain in power. So come join us for that debate at 2:30 p.m. to be facilitated by Professor Chris Landsberg of the University of Johannesburg. I thank you very much and bring this session to a close. Thank you, Palesa. Thank you, Omane Digeji. Thank you, Professor Jibewa. Thank you.